I was the one who told Silas Roan not to take the job, and I have lived 40 years regretting how nearly he listened to me. It was the spring of my 40th year, and his, give or take, and we were both of us camped broke and dry-throated at Canijo's wells with 2 horses between us, and not enough coin to feed them through the week. The Wells was a hard little nothing of a town then, a freight depot, a saloon with a sod roof, a store that charged a man double for the privilege of being thirsty, and a long view in every direction of country that wanted you dead. We had ridden in off the Saladar 3 days before, half-cooked, and we were waiting on nothing in particular, the way men do when their luck has run out and they have not yet decided to admit it. That is where Royce Talbot's foreman found us. He came into the saloon with his spurs ringing and his hat still on indoors, which told you something about him before he'd said a word, and he looked us over the way you'd look over a pair of mules at auction. He settled on Silas. Men generally did. Silas had a stillness to him that the careless mistook for slowness and the wise read correctly, and he had a scar that ran white from the corner of his left eye down into his beard, and he had eyes the gray of weather coming. The foreman, a wide man named Deaver with a soft mouth, set a gold piece on the table between Silas's hands and said his employer had worked for a man who could track and wasn't squeamish. "Track what?" Silas said. "He didn't touch the coin." "A woman," Deaver said, "run off from the Crown Tea. Mr. Talbot wants her brought back, wants it done quiet and quick. There's 20 more of these when she's home safe." I watched Silas's face and saw nothing in it, which was his way, but I knew him well enough by then to know that the word woman had landed somewhere in him and stuck. Still, 20 gold pieces was a winter and a half of eating, and we had no winter at all that I could see, so when he asked the next question I thought it was only haggling. "Run off from a husband or run off from a master," Silas said. Deaver's soft mouth tightened. "She's a widow. Talbot was good to her, took an interest after her man died, and she repaid him by stealing a horse and running. He means to marry her if you want it plain. She doesn't know yet how lucky she is. You'll bring her home and Mr. Talbot will straighten her out, and that's no business of yours either way." "No," Silas agreed, "it isn't," but he picked up the coin. I leaned across the table when Deaver had gone back out into the white glare of the street. "Silas," I said, "dragging a woman back to a man she ran from, that's not work, that's the other thing." "It's eating," he said, "and maybe she's a thief and maybe she isn't. I'll know when I see her." He turned the coin over once, twice, and put it away. "A man can take a look before he decides what he is." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. A man can take a look before he decides what he is. Silas Roan had been a great many hard things in his life by then. A soldier, a hide hunter, a hired gun in 2 range wars he was not proud of, and he had buried the only soft thing he ever owned in a grave outside a Kansas town we did not speak of. A wife and a daughter taken in a single bad winter, while he was away earning the money that was supposed to keep them. After that, he'd let the country make him into a tool, and a tool does not ask what it is. But some flint in him had never fully gone cold, and Deaver had struck it without knowing. We took the job. I want to be honest about that. We were hungry, and 20 gold pieces is 20 gold pieces, and we told ourselves that a man only has to look. She had a 3-day start on us, but a woman alone afoot, for she'd turned the stolen horse loose to throw the trail. Smart girl, leaves more sign than she thinks. And Silas could read ground the way a parson reads scripture, with the easy certainty of a man who has never doubted the text. We cut south out of Canijo's wells and onto the white edge of the Saladar, the great salt flat that lay between the Crown Tea's country and the open territory beyond. 200 miles of nothing that men crossed only when something worse was behind them. "She's making for the burnt hills," Silas said on the second day, crouched over a smear of bootprint at the lip of an arroyo. "And then the Verd if she's got the sand to cross the salt to reach 'em. She's not running blind. She's running somewhere." "That's a long way to run from a man who means to marry you," I said. if marrying's all he means. Silas didn't answer. He'd been quieter the deeper we went, and I'd noticed he had started rationing our water harder than the day called for, leaving more in the canteens than two men needed. I didn't understand it yet. I understood it the next morning, when we came over a wind-scoured ridge in the gray before sunup and saw her fire. It wasn't much of a fire. A woman who knows she's hunted builds a small one in a scrape of ground where the light won't carry, and burns it down to coals before dawn. But Silas had been looking for exactly that kind of fire, and he held up his hand and we sat our horses and watched her in the half-dark. She was kneeling at the coals warming her hands, and even from that distance you could see she was worn down to the bone. Her dress was torn at the hem to make foot-wraps, her hair had come loose and hung in a rope down her back, and there was a stillness to the way she held herself that I recognized, because it was Silas's own stillness, the stillness of someone who has decided that being afraid is a luxury they cannot afford. There was a rifle laid across her knees. She kept the rifle and turned the horse loose. That told you what she valued. "Stay here," Silas said, and got down off his horse and walked toward her with his hands held out from his sides, empty. She had the rifle up and trained on his chest before he'd taken 6 steps, and she didn't shake. "That's far enough," she called. Her voice was cracked from the dry but steady. "If Talbot sent you, you can tell him I'll put a hole in the first man through and the second and however many he sends, and he can bury you out here on his good salt, since he likes to own things so well." Silas stopped. "He sent me," he said. "Then you'd best decide whether $20 is worth dying for." "It's more than 20, Silas said, and I swear there was something almost like respect in it. "But I'm not here to die, and I'm not sure anymore I'm here to take you any place. I came to look. Lower the rifle a little and let me look." "Why would I do that?" "Because if I wanted to take you, ma'am, I'd have done it from the ridge with a rope, and you'd be tied over a saddle right now instead of having this conversation. I'm not the only man who will come. I might be the only one who will talk first." She didn't lower the rifle, but she didn't fire it either, and that was a kind of answer. The sun came up over the burnt hills behind her, throwing her shadow long across the salt, and in the new light I could see her face for the first time, sunburnt and chapped and hollow-cheeked, but with a pair of dark eyes in it that took the measure of Silas's roan in about 4 seconds and did not flinch from what they found. I have met a great many brave men in my time. I never met one braver than Tess Aldous looked, kneeling at a dead fire in the middle of 200 miles of salt, holding a rifle on a man twice her weight, and telling him to make up his mind. "Talk then," she said. "But I'll keep the rifle, and I'll tell you straight, mister, there's no story you can carry back to Talbot. There's no version of going back. He killed my husband as sure as if he'd shot him, and he'll have my land, and then he'll have me, and one morning after that I'll have an accident the way Henry had an accident, and there'll be no one left to say different. So you talk, and I'll listen, and then you'll ride off the way you came, or you'll join the rest of the things that died out here trying to take what was mine." That was the morning I watched a man decide what he was. Silas crouched down right there on the salt, slow, so the rifle could follow him, and he took off his hat. I had not seen him take off his hat for any man living. "Tell me about Henry," he said. So she told him, and I sat my horse 40 yards off and couldn't hear it, but I could see her start stiff and suspicious, and watch it come loose out of her, the way grief does when somebody finally holds still long enough to receive it. She talked a long while. The sun got high. At one point she set the rifle down across her knees again, not lowered exactly but no longer aimed, and that was when I let my breath out, because I knew then which way it was going to go. Here is what she told him, as I came to understand it over the long days after. Tess and Henry Aldous had come out to the Verd country young and married a piece of it, a green-bottomed valley with year-round water, the only good water for 60 miles, which in that country is the difference between a kingdom and a grave. They'd worked it 8 years into something worth having, which was their mistake, because a man named Royce Talbot ran 40,000 head on the dry range all around it, and the one thing he did not own was their water. He offered to buy. They wouldn't sell. He offered again, higher, then with a lawyer, then with a paper Henry didn't understand that turned out to be a note against a loan Henry had never knowingly taken. Then Henry's cattle started turning up dead in the draws. Then his fences came down in the night. Then, the spring before, Henry had ridden out to mend a tank, and his horse had come home without him. And they'd found Henry 2 days later at the bottom of a wash with his neck broke and his rifle still in the scabbard, which no man who has fallen from a spooked horse ever managed. But the county had no marshal worth the name, and Talbot owned the one judge in a day's ride. So it was written down as an accident, and that was that. And then Talbot had come to call. He had been, by Tess's account, perfectly courteous. He had explained that a widow couldn't hold that country alone, that the note he held meant the land was as good as his already, and that the kindest and most honorable thing, he used those words, *kind and *honorable, was for her to marry him and let the two holdings become one, and her grief would pass, and she would want for nothing. He had given her a month to see reason. He did not believe she would refuse. Men like Talbot never do. She had spent the month pretending to come around and stealing a little at a time. A saddle, hardtack, cartridges, a canteen, the deed to her land sewn into the lining of her coat. And on the new moon she'd taken his own horse out of his own corral, ridden it 40 miles, turned it loose, and walked out onto the salt toward the territorial line, where there was a real marshal and a real judge, and the deed in her coat might still mean something if she could only reach them alive. "And you mean to walk to the territorial line," Silas said when she'd finished. It was past noon by then. "Across the burnt hills, in those shoes." "I mean to get there," she said, "or die closer to it than I started. Those are the only 2 roads I've got, mister, and one of them runs through Royce Talbot's bedroom, so you'll forgive me if I prefer the salt." Silas was quiet a while. Then he stood up and put his hat back on and walked back to me and his horse, and his face had changed, and I knew the 20 gold pieces were gone like smoke, and I found I was glad of it. "We're not taking her back," he said. "I figured. We're getting her across." I looked out at the burnt hills, dark and broken on the far edge of the white, and beyond them the heat shimmer where the world ended. "That's 100 miles of bad," I said, "and Talbot'll send more men when we don't come back. He's got the money to send 40. "He's got the money to send 400, Silas said. "Doesn't change anything. You can ride off, Hollies. This isn't your fight and I won't hold it against you. I'll square your half of the horses when I can. I have done a great many foolish things in a long life, but I am proudest of the one I did next, which was to spit in the salt and say, 'When in 40 years have I ever ridden off and left you to do the dying alone? Get on your horse, you sentimental old fool. We've got a widow to deliver.' That is how it started. I want you to understand it didn't start with love. It started with 3 people and 2 horses in the middle of a desert that wanted them dead, and a rich man's riders coming on behind, and a deed sewn into a coat. The love came later, the way water comes to that country, slow and from underground, and you don't believe in it until you're standing in green. We made better time 3 than she'd made 1, but not by as much as you'd think, because we had 2 horses and 3 riders, and the salt was murder on the animals, and because Tess Aldous would not be carried any farther than her own pride could bear. We rigged it that 2 of us rode while one walked and led, and we traded off, and when it came her turn to walk she walked, and when Silas tried to give up his saddle to her past her share she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "I have come this far on my own feet, Mr. Roan. I'll thank you not to make me into baggage now that I've got company." And Silas, who I had watched stare down armed men without a flicker, looked away first. She was, I came to see across those days, the most capable person in our little outfit, and that included the 2 of us who'd been living off this country for 20 years. She knew the verd, knew the hidden tanks and the seep at the foot of the burnt hills that no map showed, and twice she put us onto water that Silas with all his sign reading would have ridden past. She could dress a wound, she stitched the gelding's hock when it tore on a yucca, calm as a Sunday, while the horse screamed and Silas held its head. She could shoot. She'd been shooting at running jacks to save our shells, and she didn't miss the ones that counted. And she could keep going, which out there is the only talent that finally matters, could keep walking on torn feet across ground that broke stronger people, and never once asked us to slow on her account, and several times asked us to hurry on hers. Silas didn't know what to do with her. I watched it like a man watches a slow sunrise. He had spent so long being a hard thing for hire that he'd forgotten there was a man underneath who might want something. And here was this worn-down, unbreakable woman treating him not as a danger and not as a savior, but as a partner in a hard job, talking to him plain over the fire about cattle and water and weather, and once, late, about the Kansas winter, which I had never once in 20 years heard him mention to a living soul, and which he told her about in a low voice with his eyes on the coals while she listened, and did not say any of the useless soft things people say, only at the end reached over and put her hand on his wrist for a moment and took it back. I had to get up and check the horses after that. A man my age, and I had to go check the horses. The riders found us on the 4th day, at the broken edge of the burnt hills. There were 4 of them, Crown T men, and they'd pushed their horses hard to catch us, and it showed. The animals were blown and the men were ugly with thirst and bad temper. Deaver wasn't with them. The one in front was a lean killer named Clausen who I'd heard of even out there, the kind of man Talbot kept for the work he didn't put in writing. They came up out of a dry wash and spread into a line the way men do who have done it before, and Clausen grinned at Silas with his cracked lips and said, "Roan." Mr. Talbot was starting to wonder. He'll be real interested to hear you've been escorting his property instead of returning it. She's not property, Silas said. He'd put himself between the riders and Tess without seeming to move. It had just happened, the way water finds the low ground. And the job's changed. You can tell Talbot to call his dogs off. The lady's going to the territorial line and she's going to see a judge that he doesn't own, and there's not enough money in his bank to make that my business to prevent. Clausen's grin didn't move. "There's 4 of us," he said, "and 2 of you and a woman." "That's true," Silas said. "You always could count, Roan." "I always could," Silas agreed. And then a number of things happened very fast that I will not describe in full because there is no honor in the description, only in the necessity. I will say that Tess Aldous had gotten down off the horse and into the rocks when the riders first appeared, the way Silas had taught her without ever saying a word, just a look and a tilt of his head. And I will say that when Clausen's hand finally moved it was already too late for Clausen, because Silas Roan was the fastest and the surest man with a gun I ever rode beside, and I have ridden beside some. And I will say that of the 4 men who came up out of that wash, 2 rode off and 2 did not, and that one of the 2 who rode off was carrying lead, and that none of us 3 took a scratch. None of us, that is, except that as the dust settled and I was still half deaf and shaking the way a man shakes after, I saw that the last rider going down had gotten 1 wild shot off, and that Silas was standing very still with his hand pressed to his side and a darkness spreading out under his fingers. He went down onto 1 knee, slow, almost polite, and looked up at me with something like apology and said, "Well," and then he didn't say anything else for a while. It was Tess who saved him. I want that written plain, because the story as Talbot's kind would tell it is the story of a gunman who rescued a helpless widow, and that is a lie, and lies about brave women are a particular kind of theft. Silas Roan would have died in the rocks at the edge of the burnt hills that afternoon if Tess Aldous had been the woman Talbot believed her to be. He was not. She came out of the rocks before the dust had settled and took 1 look and went to work, and she did not faint and she did not weep. She ripped her own petticoat for wadding and got the wound packed and got the bleeding slowed, and then she looked up at me with the bullet not yet out of him and said, "I need a fire, Mr. Pike, and your knife in it, and you'll hold him. And you'll hold him hard because he's going to fight us, and we have not come this far to lose him to 1 wild shot from a dead man." We held him. She took the bullet out by firelight with her sleeves rolled up and her jaw set, and Silas fought us the way she'd said he would until he passed out, which was a mercy, and she worked on through it. And I have never seen anything braver or steadier in a surgery tent with a real doctor than that woman was on her knees in the rocks with a knife and no doctor and no time. When it was done and she'd sewn him shut and we'd got him wrapped, she sat back on her heels and her hands were shaking, finally, now that it was safe to shake. And she looked at his slack gray face for a long moment and said, so quiet I don't think she meant me to hear it. Don't you die on me, Silas Roan. Don't you dare. I've had enough men die on me out here. He didn't die. He was 3 days fevered, and in those 3 days Tess Aldous did not sleep more than an hour at a stretch, and we made our slow, miserable way into the burnt hills, where there was at least shade and the seep she'd promised, cold, sweet water in a shadowed cleft, and she fed him water and broth and held him through the shaking and talked to him low when he raved. And on the 3rd night the fever broke and he woke up clear and looked at her where she sat over him with her own face gone gaunt as his. And the first thing Silas Roan said coming back from the edge of death was, you should have left me and gone on. You'd be closer by now. And Tess Aldous, who I would have sworn had no tears left in her whole burnt dry body, put her face down into her hands and cried finally, the way she hadn't cried for Henry or for the 8 years' work or for the long walk on torn feet, cried like a dam letting go, and through it she said, you impossible man. You impossible, impossible man. Which is not a thing a woman says to baggage, nor to a hired gun, and Silas reached up with the arm that worked and put his hand against her wet face the way you'd touch something you'd been told all your life you weren't allowed to want, and neither of them said anything else, and I got up old, and my knees aching, and my own eyes not as dry as I'd have liked, and went to check the horses one more time. You will want to know about Talbot. I'll get to Talbot. But I want to say first that the best days of that whole hard passage were the days in the burnt hills while Silas mended, which makes no sense, because we were 3 hunted people pinned in a dry range with a wounded man and a rich enemy's reach all around us. And yet I think of those days as good ones, and I think they do too, wherever they are now. Silas couldn't ride, so we couldn't run. So for the first time in all that flight there was nothing to do but wait and heal and be. And in the waiting, the two of them came together the way I'd watched it coming since the morning on the salt, slow and careful. 2 people who'd both lost the thing they loved most and had each privately sworn never to risk it again, circling the fact of each other like cold men circling a fire they're afraid to trust. They talked, Lord, how they talked once Silas had breath for it, about Henry and about Kansas and about the Verd country and what it had been and might be again. About small foolish things, she could not abide a man who wouldn't eat the burnt part of the biscuit, she said, and Silas, who'd eaten burnt biscuit his whole life because he'd never had any other kind, solemnly took the burnt half off her plate from then on, and it became a joke between them, the kind of small private joke that means 2 people are building something. She cut his hair with my knife. He whittled when his hands were steady enough, and made her a comb out of horn because hers had broken on the salt, working at it through the long afternoons with his tongue between his teeth. And when he gave it to her gruff, looking off at the hills, holding it out sideways like he was ashamed of it, she took it and turned it over and ran her thumb along the teeth he'd filed so careful and even, and she said, nobody's made me anything in a long time. And Silas Roan turned the color of the burnt hills at sundown and could not look at her. And I thought, well, there it is. That's the whole thing right there in a horn comb, and it's done now and there's no undoing it. One evening I found them sitting a little apart from the fire, not touching, watching the dark come on over the broken country, and Tess was saying, I keep thinking what happens after if we get there. If the judge is honest and the deed holds and Talbot's stopped, I get my valley back. I get the water and the grass and the 8 years of work. And I'll be standing in the middle of it alone, with the whole thing safe and Henry in the ground, and she stopped. And you'll have one, Silas said. And I'll have one, she agreed. And I cannot for the life of me, lately, picture standing there alone in it. Isn't that a strange thing? To fight your way across the whole world to keep a thing and find you can't picture keeping it by yourself anymore. Silas was quiet a long time. He was a man who weighed his words like coin because he'd spent so few of them on anything that mattered. "I've got nothing to offer a woman with land and grass and water," he finally said. "I'm a gun. I've been a gun so long I forget there was ever anything else. A man like me doesn't end up in a green valley, Tess. He ends up in the rocks at the edge of someplace like I near did 3 days back. That's the way." "That," said Tess Aldous, "is the single most cowardly thing I have heard you say, and you nearly bled out in front of me without making a sound, so I know cowardice doesn't come natural to you and you're having to work at it." And Silas laughed. I heard him laugh, which in 20 years I could count the times, and she went on, gentler. "I'm not asking you to be a Green Valley man, Silas. I'm asking you whether, when this is finished, you'd like to find out what you are when nobody's paying you to be a gun. Because I think there's a man down under all that, and I think I've met him this week, and I find I'd like to know him better. That's all. That's the whole of it. You don't have to answer out here on the salt. You can answer in the green when we're standing in it." He didn't answer, but that night I noticed he'd moved his bedroll a little nearer hers, not improper, just nearer, the way a cold man moves toward a fire he's finally decided to trust. And in the morning when she woke, he had the coffee made and the burnt biscuit already on his own plate, and she looked at the 2 plates and smiled in a way I hadn't seen her smile, and I thought, that man has answered. He just doesn't have the words for it yet. He'll find them in the green. We never got the green the easy way. I never expected we would. But Talbot came himself. That was the thing none of us had counted on, because men like Royce Talbot do not ride out onto the salt. They hire other men to ride out onto the salt and bleed and die on it while they sit in cool rooms and wait to be told it's handled. But the 2 riders who'd gotten away from the burnt hills had carried back word that Roan had turned, and that the widow was alive and protected and bound for a judge that couldn't be bought, and that the deed was real and on her person, and that changed Talbot's arithmetic. The deed in a friendly judge's hands was a story about an accident and a grieving widow's confusion. The deed in an honest judge's hands, with a living woman to swear to murder and theft and a forced marriage, was a rope. So Talbot did the thing his kind do exactly once, when their whole world is at stake. He came himself, to make sure of it, with a dozen men at his back and fresh horses and water to spare, because he had decided that Tess Aldous and the deed in her coat must not reach the territorial line alive, and a thing that important a careful man sees to with his own eyes. We knew he was coming because we saw the dust 2 days out, and there's only one thing that makes that much dust in that country. Silas could ride by then, after a fashion, hunched and gray but ahorse, and we ran. We ran the last hard stretch out of the burnt hills, and down the long grade toward the broken country at the edge of the territory, where the salt gave way to brush, and then, far ahead, a green line that was the first cottonwood of the Verd drainage, the edge of the safe country, the edge of the world we were trying to reach. And behind us the dust came on faster, because they had the fresh horses and we had 2 tired ones and a wounded man. And by the second afternoon of that running, they had closed it to where we could see the riders strung out under their own dust, and we all 3 knew the cold arithmetic of it. We were not going to reach the cottonwoods ahead of them. They were going to catch us in the open, in the broken ground at the foot of the grade. A dozen men and Talbot, against 2 guns and a brave woman, and a man who could barely sit his saddle. It was Tess who found the place. Of course it was. She knew that country down in her bones the way you know the house you grew up in, and she put us into a jumble of broken rock at the mouth of the drainage, where the trail pinched narrow between 2 stone shoulders. The kind of place where a dozen men can't bring their numbers to bear all at once, where 2 good rifles in the rocks above could hold a great many men below for a long while, and she said, "Here. They have to come through here single and slow or go a half-day around, and Talbot won't go around, his pride won't let him. He'll come straight through and try to buy or bluster, and that's where we beat him, not with guns, with the deed. You let me talk to him. You keep your rifles on him and you let me talk." "Tess," Silas said, "he's come to kill you, there's no talking." "He's come to make sure I don't reach the judge," she said. Those aren't the same thing. A man like Talbot doesn't want murder if cheaper will do. Murder's a loose end. Murder's the thing he killed Henry to avoid having to do to me in the open. He wants me to come quiet, or he wants the deed, or he wants me dead and buried where no one finds me and the story stays an accident. So we take away the quiet, and we take away the buried where no one finds it, by being right here at the edge of the territory where if shots are fired honest men a day's ride off will hear and come asking. And we make him choose, in front of his own men, between being the courteous baron he pretends to be and being the murderer he is, out loud, where his men can hear which one he picks. His men will follow a baron. I don't know how many of them will follow a man who guns down a widow in the rocks in front of them for a piece of paper. Maybe all of them, but maybe not, and maybe's all we've got. I looked at Silas and Silas looked at me and we both looked at her, this worn-down woman who'd walked out onto the salt with a rifle and a sewn indeed, and a plan she'd been refining for 40 miles. And Silas said, soft, "You should have been running the Crown Tea instead of marrying into a hardscrabble valley. Talbot never had a chance." "Henry never let me run anything," she said. "It was the one foolish thing about him. Now get up in those rocks, both of you, and for God's sake, Silas, don't fall off your horse where Talbot can see. It'll spoil the effect." And then Royce Talbot rode up into the mouth of the drainage, with 11 men behind him. He was not what I expected. I'd built him into a monster across all those miles, and what came up the trail was a soft, handsome man of 50 in a good coat, gray at the temples, with mild eyes and clean hands, the kind of man who'd be charming at a church social. And that was the horror of him, that the 8 years of slow murder and the dead husband and the forced courtship all wore that pleasant, unremarkable face. He drew up below us easy, and looked up at the rocks where he could see Tess standing in the open with her deed in her hand, and our 2 rifle barrels just showing on either side of her, and he smiled like a disappointed schoolmaster. "Tess," he said, "my dear girl, look at the state of you. Do you have any idea the worry you've caused? Half my men chasing all over the salt in this heat. You've made yourself ill. Come down now and let's get you home and put all this behind us. I'm not an unreasonable man. There's no reason this can't still end the way I'd hoped, the way that's best for you." "I'm not coming down, Royce," she said. Her voice carried clear off the rocks. "And I'm not going home because I have no home but this valley behind me and I'm going to keep it. I have the deed here in my hand, free and clear. The real one, not the forged note your lawyer made Henry sign drunk. I have it, and I'm half a day from a marshal who doesn't owe you money and a judge who never has. And I am going to tell that judge how Henry died. I'm going to tell him about the dead cattle and the cut fences and the wash with the broken neck and the rifle still in the scabbard. And then I'm going to tell him how you came courting before the grave was settled and gave a widow a month to marry her husband's murderer. So you can ride up here and take this paper off my body and explain the shooting to all these men. Go on, look at them, look at their faces. Or you can turn that good horse around and ride back to the Crown Tea and start burning the papers you'll wish you'd never signed. Those are your roads, Royce. I crossed 200 miles of salt to give you the same hard choice you gave me. Choose." I have been in some long silences. That was the longest. Talbot's mild eyes weren't mild anymore. He looked up at her, and at the 2 rifle barrels, and this was Tess's whole gamble, the thing she'd seen that we hadn't. He looked back over his shoulder at his 11 men, to see how it sat with them, and I watched it sit badly. These were range hands mostly, not killers. Clausen and his kind were dead in the burnt hills, and they had ridden 2 hard days expecting to run down a thief. And what they'd found at the end of it was a half-dead widow on a rock telling a story about a murdered husband that fit all the things they'd half known and not let themselves think about. And now their boss was sitting there not denying it, just going cold and still in the face, and you could feel it travel down that line of tired men. The slow turning of it, the "we did not sign on for this." A big quiet hand at the back, I learned his name later, it was a man called Prout, turned his horse sideways out of the line. Just sideways. Didn't ride off, didn't speak. Just took himself out of the shooting where everyone could see. And then another did. And Talbot saw it, saw his own men deciding in front of him which man he was, exactly the way Tess had built it, and something broke in his careful, handsome face. And for one moment I thought he was going to do the stupid thing, go for the killing anyway, take her with him into the rope. And Silas thumbed his hammer back where Talbot could hear it, slow and loud in the silence, and said the only words he spoke that whole afternoon. "Don't." Royce Talbot did not get to die a baron's death in a gunfight, which I think galled him worse than dying would have. He turned his horse. He rode back down the drainage with what was left of his men strung out behind him in ones and twos, no longer a column, just men going home, and he never reached the Crown T as its master, because Prout and 2 others peeled off that very night and rode the half-day to the territorial line ahead of us and told the marshal everything before Tess ever got there. And by the time the law and the territory and the honest judge were done unwinding 8 years of Royce Talbot's careful murder, the Crown T was sold off in pieces to pay the lawsuits, and Talbot himself spent what was left of his soft, clean hands' worth of days in a territorial cell, which is the dullest place in the world for a man who lived to own things, and I am told he hated every hour of it, and I am not a good enough Christian to be sorry. We brought Tess Aldous to the marshal's office at the territory line on a bright morning with the cottonwoods green and loud with birds all up the Verd drainage, and she walked in on her own 2 ruined feet and laid the deed on the table and told her story plain and clear. And the judge was honest, and the law was on her side because the truth was, and the valley was hers, free and clear, the way Henry would have wanted and could never have managed. That should be the end of it. The widow saved, the land secured, the villain in his cell. But that is the kind of ending Talbot's sort tell, and it leaves out the only part that finally matters, which is the green. Silas Roan rode Tess Aldous home to her valley because there was no one else to do it and because she asked him to. And when they came up over the last rise and the whole green bottom opened out below them, the year-round water silver in the sun, the grass deep, the cottonwoods huge along the creek, the little house Henry built standing empty and waiting, Tess reined in and looked at it a long while, and Silas sat his horse a little behind her, gray and healing and silent. The way he'd ridden behind her the whole way, between her and the danger. "Well," she said finally, not turning around, "here's the green, Silas Roan. I told you could answer me in the green." And I, who had no business being there for it and pretended to be very busy with the pack horse some yards off, heard Silas Roan be braver than he'd been in any gunfight in his life. I heard him say, "I don't have the words for it that you'd have. I never learned that kind. But I know I've spent my whole life being a thing men paid for, and I rode out onto that salt to do one more low piece of work, and somewhere out there a woman holding a rifle on me asked me to find out what I was when nobody was paying. And I think, Tess, I think what I am is a man who'd like to stay. If you'd have him. Not for the land, not for the water. I'd stay if you had nothing but the rifle and the salt. I'd stay for the burnt half of the biscuit. I don't know how to say it better than that." There was a silence, and then I heard Tess Aldous laugh, that laugh I'd only heard start to come out of her in the burnt hills, full now and unafraid, and she said, "That, you stubborn man, is exactly how to say it." And when I finally let myself look, they had got down off their horses and she had her face against his chest and his arms around her, careful of his bad side, the 2 of them standing in the green that they had crossed 200 miles of white death to reach. And the only thing I will tell you about what came after that is that it is none of your business and none of mine, and that I took the horses down to the creek to drink and gave them all the time in the world about it. They were married that autumn by a circuit preacher under the biggest of the cottonwoods, and I stood up for Silas because there was no one else and because I'd earned it, and Tess wore a dress that was not torn at the hem and shoes that fit, and Silas Roan, who I had ridden beside for 20 hard years and seen do every violent thing this country asks of a man, stood there in a borrowed clean shirt with his hat in his hands and his white scar gone pale against a face that had, somewhere out on that crossing, learned how to be soft again. And when the preacher asked him the question, he said, "I do," asterisk, in a voice that cracked, and I had to look very hard at the cottonwoods. I stayed on through that first winter and helped them get the place running again, and then I drifted, the way I do, the way Silas used to. But I came back. I came back a great many times over the years, because the Verde Valley was the closest thing to a home I ever had, on account of the two people in it. The valley prospered because good water and good grass and two people who'll outwork the sun generally do prosper. The cattle came back. The fences stood. They had children, a girl first, and Tess named her Hope, which made Silas go off and be very busy with the horses for a while. And then two boys, and Silas roan, the fastest gun I ever rode beside, hung that gun on a peg over the door where it gathered dust, and learned to be a man who mended fence and pulled calves and carried small children on his shoulders down to the creek. And I will tell you, I never saw a man take to anything the way he took to that. He still ate the burnt biscuit. They still laughed about it, 30 years on, an old joke gone soft and worn smooth as a creek stone with all the holding. The last time I saw them both, they were old and I was older, and we sat out on the porch of the house Henry built, and Silas had doubled in size in the long gold evening, and watched the grandchildren. There were grandchildren by then, running down through the deep grass toward the water, and Tess Aldous, white-haired and straight-backed in her chair, with the horn comb that Silas had whittled her in the burnt hills holding up her hair, the same comb all those years. Looked out at the green she'd crossed the world to keep and said, to no one, to all of us, "I used to think I'd won when I got it back, standing in it alone. I had no idea what winning was." And Silas, beside her, didn't say anything, the way he never said much. He just reached over and took her hand the way he'd taken it the first time on the floor of the burnt hills when he came back from the fever, and held it, an old hard hand gone gentle, and the two of them sat there in the green and the gold light and watched their grandchildren run. I think about that often now, being old and mostly alone myself, with the country I knew nearly gone. I think about how I told Silas Roan not to take the job, how close he came to listening to me. How a man can ride out onto the salt one low morning meaning to drag a woman home for 20 gold pieces, and instead find, somewhere out in all that white nothing, holding a rifle and refusing to be afraid, the one thing the country never managed to take from him after all, which was the soft thing underneath, the thing he'd buried in Kansas and sworn off forever, the thing she dug back up out of him with a knife and a horn comb and the burnt half of a biscuit, out there on the killing ground, where nobody was paying him to be anything but exactly what he was. He decided what he was. That was the whole of it. A man can take a look, he told me once, before he decides what he is. He took a look, and he chose the green.